Thank you, Andre. Welcome to our entire audience. Hope you're having a good day. We have a lot of information to cover today. The title of our presentation today is called the IRCH Methodology for Creating Legally Defensive Retention Schedules. That's going to be the main focus of the beginning of my program. And then, as Andre indicated, I will get into answers to some of the questions that came up during the course of the session. Course of your correspondence earlier. So with no further ado, let's get moving along. So the topics, as I indicated, are creating legally defensible retention schedules. I'll talk a little bit about the method that we follow and why that is, in my opinion, the best for creating legally defensible retention schedules. And to reiterate that, I'll talk a little bit about defending the retention schedule and procedures in court, some of my experiences as an expert witness, and explain the methodology that an expert would follow in defending a retention schedule. Then I will get into a series of questions. I kind of lump them together into various topics, and hopefully we can deal with all of those during the course of this 1 hour. So what does it mean to create a legally defensible schedule and what's required? We believe in complete legal research. We have seen so many retention schedules where either the company or consultant or even a law firm has found the controlling or longest legal requirement and indicated that that was the research and the company followed that provision as their legal requirements. But what about all the other dozens of legal requirements that also apply to those records? You may or may not know whether those have been researched adequately. So if you get your arms around all the legal research, then you have a much better opportunity to see that the whole spectrum of laws related to your records have been considered, included in the project, and as you'll see a little bit later, it is such a strong piece of evidence when you have to defend the retention schedule and retention period in court, especially if there's ever a claim that you're keeping records too long. Somebody might want to believe that you should keep it shorter or destroy personal identifying information sooner, and that may become a big issue in the future. Our legal grouping method, therefore, of putting legal research together in logical groupings and then applying them to the same or similar records promotes consistency, has a very clear methodology of how it's done, and is repeatable. Jumping ahead to the last point on my slides, it is the one feature that really helps you as you update your retention schedules each year. Consistency is the key issue. I can't stress this enough. Consistency in how you treat records so similar records are treated similarly. We at IRCH have developed over the course of time a worldview, and I'll elaborate a little bit more of how we approach these issues. We don't approach each issue fresh, with fresh eyes, as though we've never seen it before. We learn from our experience, establish a way of dealing with areas, and consistently deal with it that way unless there's a reason to do it differently. It's also important to have a clear linkage between your records and the legal research. It's one thing to have a whole pile of legal research and then a whole listing of records over on the side. If the two aren't brought together in a consistent way, that years into the future, you or your successor, if nobody knows what was the connection, you're not going to be able to defend yourself in court, and you'll have great difficulty winning on this records retention issue. So what's the worldview that I'm talking about? And we've had this in effect since the mid-1980s. As I've been doing my records retention work and working with many clients. It's a standard way of looking at records. Those of you who are subscribers to Retention Wizard or Retention Manager know we start with a set of general business records and it's standard. We pretty much keep that the way it is. It's rare that there's ever a change. It's a standard way of dealing with these common types of records. A lot of customization, however, goes into industry-specific records. But after we've worked in an industry, we start standardizing those. You may have heard we're coming up with templates. Templates represent a pretty generic view of how we look at an industry. Obviously, we can't customize it for everybody in a template, but we can give you a good starting point that you can complete the work of customizing and take you much further than we've been able to take you previously. The consistent view also looks at the purpose of the record, what it is used for, not what it is. So many people look at the title and try to classify it as this subject or that subject. We're looking at what the record is used for. It may be reference, for example. It's used to store information that you may be using into the future. But I've given you some examples related to contracts. And the worldview would be pretty much like a contract is a contract is a contract. We're going to treat all contracts the same, but many of these have different names. So we're all familiar with contracts, but a lease is a contract. A purchase order is a contract. And so they're all going to be treated the same way for the same purpose. But most of you will probably wouldn't consider advertising a contract. If you look around, except for a few limited industry-specific requirements, there are not requirements for advertising. In the insurance industry, yes, they have very specific requirements, but most general industries don't have requirements on advertising. So how do we come up with our retention for that? We treat it as a quasi-contract. If you say your product or service does A, B, and C, and a customer relies on that, you have formed a quasi-contract based upon a reliance. And therefore, if your claims fail to be true, that person has the same types of rights they would have had if they had signed a contract with you. Your advertising people may not understand the ramifications of this, but I'm sure you will find situations where what I've described is exactly true. Customers have claimed you had said such and such, and now the product doesn't comply. Stock ownership is another thing. There are a few requirements related to stock ownership, but it's also a contract between the shareholder and the company. The company says, we will pay you dividends, we will do things within our company to be cost effective so there's more profits, so there would be more dividends. Shareholder says, I'll give you money in exchange for that, and I'll take some shares of stock. And so it is a contract between the shareholder and the company. There's also some additional regulation that comes into play. But I want to show you how we will look at a number of areas that don't seem to be the same or similar and find a similarity between them. In the legal group index with legal research, those of you who, again, have Retention Manager or Retention Wizard get opportunities to look at this report. We have the opportunity here to describe a legal group, in this case ACC 000, generally our biggest legal group, related to all the tax accounting laws that we normally would find in the various jurisdictions from U.S. federal and the states in the United States. Notice just in my initial list, using our LRBR codes with the postal abbreviations, we use U.S. for U.S. federal. There are not U.S. federal tax requirements. They have limitations of assessment. They have a few things related to payroll in particular, but in terms of general accounting, that is not their way of doing it. A couple states do, and they have 6-year requirements. Some have 5-year requirements. People ask me, which laws do you have to comply with? You have to comply with all of them. And by organizing all the legal research, if some of the longest requirements get repealed or changed to shorter requirements, then the legal requirements period will definitely change. And therefore, you can see how this all lines up. You can explain where the 6-year retention period came from that ultimately would be applied to your records. This report is extremely powerful when you ever have to defend your retention schedule, because it basically identifies you have done significant research, you have done significant work, and therefore you take retention seriously. If you made a recommendation, and this is the recommendation followed by your company, it was based upon very important issues. So what is the linkage then between the records? Those, again, who have worked with our products have worked with this linkage all along. Those with Retention Wizard don't get to see all of it. For example, you don't get to see the retention rules and legal groups, but you'll be able to see ultimately how the record series matches the legal research. Those with the retention manager see it all. So user records would be the old retention schedule, a listing of records the company has, a listing of an inventory from various departments. Those are all linked then to items in the standard record series, and this is where you'll get your descriptions of records. The retention rules then will establish rules of retention, very broad categories of record series. These tend to be more granular for the standard record series. The retention rules are very broader, and when I talk about buckets, I will relate to these two. These are the little buckets, so the small buckets, the standard record series, more descriptions of records, more granular. These are the larger buckets, fewer descriptions of records, but very broad. Ultimately, each relates to the legal group, like I was showing you, where we link it to the legal research and we reach our conclusions. Notice, going backwards, if the legal research changes, the legal group could change, the rules could change, the standard record series could change, and the retention applied to the user records or the record titles can change. And that's pretty powerful when you do an update. We know all the types of records that are affected by those changes. Okay, so what happens then when you have to defend a retention schedule in court? Well, I can say that IRCH developed retention schedule has never been challenged in court. It's been asked for and questions have been raised from what some of our customers have said. But when the information on how the retention schedule was developed and an explanation was provided, the opposing party quickly realized it was futile to pursue this issue, and because anybody who has used our methodology or has something very similar to it will show significant support for the retention schedule. So I can conclude that a legally defensible retention schedule will be upheld because it is significant. What we do is very much like the Cadillac of records retention. Courts will probably accept some other ideas that are lesser, but this is the only certain way. Now, we have had issues that have come up in a number of cases related to retention and other factors, and I have enjoyed the opportunity to be an expert witness now in about 14 matters. I'm going on my 15th currently. And let me just explain what an expert witness does and how it would relate to a records retention program. You need to identify an expert. Sometimes it may be the records manager in your company. That's the person who knows most about how the retention schedule is developed. Sometimes it's an outside party who developed it. We've run into situations where the current records manager was not involved in developing the retention schedule, and therefore I got involved in assisting the company and the lawyers in explaining how the retention schedule was developed. If you are a new records manager, I strongly advise you, if you've inherited a retention schedule that was developed by somebody else, to take the time and learn how it was developed and why those numbers are what they are, because at some point you may be asked, and it would be really good if you had the knowledge of where it all came from. Conflicts are an area that the lawyers are concerned about. An expert should not be working for either of the parties in the litigation. They could represent, the party that you're whose side you're on, but that has to be revealed to the other side. And then if you've worked for the other parties, you need to explain that, because maybe you have some insider information that it wouldn't be fair for you to testify about. Experts consult with attorneys. The experts aren't left alone. We work with the attorneys on our side because they help us focus on what are the issues of the case, what materials we have to look at. Because the next point, and it's sometimes very voluminous, one expert opportunity I had to look at 7,000 pages of transcript. The expert reviews the pleadings, the depositions, the documents. They could be a whole variety of things, because we don't have the opportunity to, we weren't there when events took place. So basically what we're doing is looking at what information is available and reaching our conclusions accordingly. An expert witness will then write a report with findings and conclusions. In litigation, by the way, only an expert can express their opinions. You, if you're ever called to testify, must testify about facts, not opinions. An expert can speculate about opinions based upon information. They could be challenged how they formulate their opinion. So in reviewing a retention schedule, I'll look at what was done, whether we developed it or not, or somebody else developed it, and look at a variety of issues in making a decision. And then an expert could appear at deposition, could appear at trial. For the first time, I did a telephone deposition. I've never quite done that, with a court reporter in my office and the other parties on the telephone in a remote location. So how would you specifically defend the retention schedule, and how would I do that as an expert? First, you would explain the schedule and supporting documentation. And the key is what was in effect at the time in question. So we don't care what the current retention schedule is. If the matter in question came up in 2005, we need to have the retention schedule, the legal research, the documentation that existed as of 2005. That's why it's important to keep at least one set of the retention schedule, procedures, and documentation, including legal research, how it was developed, even though you've now moved on to a new retention schedule. Of course, users, your employees out there, should have only the most current procedures, because we want them to do the right thing according to current practices. But you, as records managers, somewhere in your organization, have to keep this full set of documentation to be able to show what was the retention program and how it was implemented. I don't have that specifically at this point on the slide. Actually, I do on the last point. The implementation, the fact that you had a retention schedule but nobody followed it doesn't mean you destroyed records properly under the retention schedule. Therefore, you need to show that it was, in fact, implemented. You may have to explain the prevailing retention practices. So, for example, I was involved in an arbitration, and one of the things that came up was a concern that our recommendation for 6 years was too long. My response was, gee, that's surprising, because most of the world believes the retention for accounting records should be 7 years, and some of my clients want to do it 10 years. I have never, ever seen in 30 years an organization have a retention for accounting records less than 6 years. And therefore, For somebody to say it should be shorter is preposterous. So looking at prevailing practices of others is sometimes helpful. Explain your procedures, how you do things. From the legal group, you may have to talk about that controlling law. What does it have to deal with? What were the longest legal requirements? These are state requirements in the accounting area that say we have to keep records for 6 years. And since that's for state income tax or other state tax purposes, that means all our accounting records would have to be kept for that period of time. You need to show compliance with the retention schedule. It's really sad to develop and invest in a strong retention program and not follow it. You need to make sure it's being followed. You need to have periodic audits beyond the scope of today's session, but those are all important things. But the key is to demonstrate consistency in your program. You're doing the same thing all the time, and consistent and systematic development and implementation of the program. If you do it all, it's documented, you'll be able to show it. Just out of curiosity, there were some questions about what type of expert experience I encounter, and I've dealt with destruction of records and litigation while litigation was in progress, and one of the more interesting questions is when it was imminent, or when it was about to happen, and we won big on that. By the way, in every expert situation, I've been on the winning side, partially because I won't take on a matter unless I believe in the merits of the case. Failure to produce records after a subpoena was issued. Did the parties act properly, or did they destroy the records properly under retention schedule? Support for a retention program. Is this a good program or not? I've been asked to look at a retention period based upon the claims of the other party, who said records should have existed, and in one case I supported a retention schedule and said that period was very reasonable, and there were reasons why the company adopted it. What is a record? This comes up periodically. Questions of email always come up. Why should records be destroyed? I had a question in trial where I presented the retention schedule for the company, and the attorney on the other side said, well, instead of destroying the records, why didn't you microfilm everything? And I said, because that would be a bad idea. And he was astounded. He said, wouldn't it cost that much? I said, it would cost a lot of money, but why waste money of an organization? A corporation has a duty to be cost effective, comply with the law, and there's no reason to do this task because it would be wasteful. And we don't keep records, by the way, just because the other side would like us to have it. And my favorite was bad government record-keeping practices, where we found that actually the Colorado Bureau of Investigation had an abysmal system for doing gun control checks on potential purchasers of guns. And someday, if anybody's interested in that, send me an email. I'll describe a little bit what happened in that case. Okay, so let's get on. That was half of my presentation. So the other half is I want to deal with some of the questions that you raised leading up to today's session, and several of them I've put into context. People have asked me about how do you do records classification, can computers do it, about the bucket theories, and whether we should have many records described in our retention schedule or few records. One said, I have 3. How do I match the legal research to that? Difficult problem. I want to talk a little bit about unmanaged information. We had a couple questions about big data and retention, how that all fits together. Email, as you'll see, is also unmanaged, but it's a very special topic. And global retention schedules, how we approach that, and what are some of the approaches you have available to you, and the pros and cons of each of those. So let's get into bucket theories. For years at ARMA conferences, this was a raging issue where some people said we need a large number of small buckets, very granular, that describe our records, 200 to 300 may even be a small number. The largest retention schedule I ever saw allowed everybody to classify any record, any file they ever wanted over decades, and they had 23,000 items. It was our task to boil that down, and we got it down under 400 in terms of classification. But these are many smaller buckets. And then some people say we should have bigger buckets, broader buckets, 100 buckets or less. 3, I don't think I would advocate, but we have done retention schedules with the record series in the 70s for simpler companies. But, it tends to be more in the range of 150 to 250, and for very, very large, complicated companies, if we can get it under 400, we're doing good. So what then is the difference between all these record classification strategies? The small bucket theory is the traditional record series describing organizational records. That has been the traditional retention schedule with several hundred items in it. Users would select from a few of the hundreds of items in determining what the retention would be for the records. So that's whether it's paper or in the electronic world, users would have to go to a list and assign a record series from hundreds. But because these smaller buckets are more granular, they also do some classification. So you may have different entries for general contracts and leases and labor contracts and employment contracts and copier maintenance or equipment maintenance contracts. So you may have different classes of contracts, but they're all contracts and treated the same way for retention, but you've also classified them to a deeper level. You've said what this thing is with a little more detail than just a contract. The bigger buckets that people have advocated, it's like a limited set of retention rules. Remember I showed you in our scheme we had record series. Those are the small buckets. The big buckets are our records retention rules. So actually in working our system you end up having both systems, big buckets and little buckets, and you can use those in different ways. Users select from 100 or fewer items, and classification requires additional indexing because when you shorten the number of items, like to 3 or 10 or 50, as some people have advocated, then you have to give more information, so you're going to have to make at least a second index entry to classify it. And of course there would be some other information that you might want for finding purposes. So what is the approach we like? Well, we follow both of those, but we like one better, and I call it the fewer buckets per group or fewer buckets per person approach. So accounting, if you look at the entire retention schedule, maybe uses 20 to 25 of the record series or buckets. Accounts payable, accounts receivable, payroll, accounting reporting, capital property, inventories, valuations. I mean, there's a variety of things they're going to have, but it's 20 to 25 they use regularly. Accounting is not going to deal with engineering, the engineering part of the retention schedule, or the property management, other than if their rent's due to be paid, they'll pay it, but not the contracts and things like that. So they deal in their domain. Human resources deals in its domain. So they might have 30 to 40 buckets with, personnel selection, employment records, health and safety, benefits. So I'm just putting some random numbers. And I put Joe and Sally over here. Oops, come on back, Joe and Sally. I put Joe and Sally over here because these could be anybody else in the organization, and it could be an individual. How many items from the retention schedule does an individual need? 10, 15, they don't need 300. So how do we make this all work? And that is the fewer bucket per person or per group approach. So how do we do this? It includes all the advantages of record series and retention rules. Departments and groups just select the relevant items. It actually should be from the record series. So if there are 300 record series, accounting would go out and just identify the 30 or 40 they use. Or human resources or Joe and Sally would just identify the ones they use. So users typically select from 10 to 35 items, and if for some reason a new record need shows up, they can pull from the full list over here, and they will be able to then search whatever they want. Unfortunately, many of the records and information management systems do not support this type of concept. Wouldn't it be nice, for example, to be able to pre-select the record series, and when you log in under your ID, you will see the record series that are relevant for you, that you work on. And the guy in the next booth could have a different set, and the girl in the next booth could have just still a different set. And from that standpoint, everybody can customize the ones that they initially see, or you can learn from experience. If you start assigning documents you have to certain record series, those become higher ranked, like in a Google search, for example, and you would be able to see those types of records series from the retention schedule listed first. And of course, you can go to the full listing. So what's the answer? It's not big buckets. It's not little buckets. It's the right number of buckets per person or group. And in Retention Manager, you have the capabilities of doing all of this. And I just wish the vendors would start heeding my requests and make their software include features that would allow this to happen, and we would see great improvement on acceptance of electronic document management and the application of record series and retention. Okay, unmanaged information. I make the very bold statement at the beginning that retention, records retention, cannot be applied to unmanaged information. It just cannot be done. So there are a lot of people, not a lot of people, some vendors claim they have technology that can classify things using artificial intelligence. No way, no how. No system can identify what's a record, and no system can really apply retention other than in the most granular, not granular, broad sense. This is an employment record because it came from an employee who works in human resources. The ability to identify what it is, how it applies to the retention schedule, requires the following. You need to identify what are records. Machines can't do this. Human beings can. Of all the stuff, what is the important stuff we need to keep? And what is the final version of the records? And what is the official version versus a copy? Employees know how to do this. They've been doing it all the time. I don't agree with any vendor who has said, oh, their computer system can do this for you. Employees must do it. You then move the records to a record-keeping system. Now, in order to get employees to do these things, we got to make it simple, efficient, and worth their while. Like when they do it, they'll have better access to information. You classify the information by assigning it to a record series. For purposes of retention, we need two tasks: identifying what is a record and to classify it to a record series. Retention is then applied indirectly through the record series. Once you put it into the record series bucket, the documents you have, especially in the electronic world, will inherit the retention from that record series. But here's where I differ from a lot of other people. Once you have moved the good stuff to a record-keeping system, I want to destroy the rest. Because if you allow all this random junk out there, one, you have no incentive for users to move the good stuff over to your record-keeping system, and you'll be losing more and more records over time. And number two, this will make sure in litigation that records are identified and preserved and maintained, and all the other stuff is gone. Because if you talk with your attorneys, you will find the biggest cost in many litigations today is the cost of discovery, just identifying, looking for, examining, searching, turning over to the other party any records and information in your possession that is relevant to the particular case. And unfortunately, the more stuff you have, the more costly it will be, even if you've done nothing wrong. You'll have to explain certain comments, you'll have to go through these tasks. And in large situations with large companies or large lawsuits, we're not talking about thousands of dollars, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars that are just squandering, going through all this junk. I am a believer that junk needs to be eliminated to force records to be kept for the greater good of the organization. Okay, big data is another form of unmanaged information. I don't give a definition of big data, but it's all this material that organizations will throw into some type of archive, some type of management system. So it all could be searched. We don't know what purposes the searches will be done in the future, but we'll preserve it all just in case, look for trends, look for whatever. I have a nephew who was hired by an insurance company, and it's not because he was looking for things in the insurance records in their big data. He was commissioned to look for anything useful that might be appropriate for the company to think about or areas to invest in other than insurance. So big data is a very interesting and important area, but it has all the problems and concerns of unmanaged information. I mentioned litigation. Those advocates of big data, keeping it for long periods of time, it undermines the retention program because you can't place the retention on this stuff. Most of the systems don't allow it. They are happy to have random data that's unmanaged, unclassified, etc. And in my opinion, it's a disaster in litigation. It's only going to get worse because you have all this stuff, you got to search it, etc. If you miss things, you got a major problem. I'll give you one solution, and I've had discussions with companies about this. If you remove the personal identifying information from big data, so what does that mean? I, as a customer, go to your store and I buy a product. So you have my name, my address, how much I paid, whether I use a credit card, a cash, and the product that was purchased. You also have information on the store location and things like that. If you kept all my personal information, you have a transaction record which should be covered in your retention schedule. If it's put into the big data system and preserved like in a big archives so searches can be done at some future date, then you'll want to keep this for long periods of time, of course ignoring the retention schedule because it's all potential reference and all potentially of value. But if you remove my personal identifying information, my name, my address, my phone number, perhaps even a trace of my credit card number, you do know there was a transaction that took place on a certain date of this product in this location, and you have a lot of valuable information, but it's no longer a record of that transaction. You have stripped off the attributes, perhaps, that would make it a record in the traditional sense of that transaction, and you're left with some data that would be useful for your company for doing some analysis. So what this does, it converts the previous records to miscellaneous data. And I'm pretty good with that, because if a subpoena came in, for transactions of Donald Skupsky, for example, in the big data archive, you wouldn't be able to find anything. And therefore, it probably is a defense against litigation, and again, still useful for a lot of data discovery, not discovery, but data research purposes. Which gets us to electronic mail. And also, electronic mail is unmanaged information. It's junk that comes into your system. Some of you, maybe not all of you, some of you will manage it on one level by maybe establishing a set of rules. So emails from certain people with certain subjects will go into certain files and certain folders, and you'll have some ability to manage this. Unfortunately, everybody manages it their own way. And this is not a good way of recording, preserving records for the company. It is a tool of communication. So many people have said, how long do I keep my email? I keep telling them, email is not a record. It's a tool of communication, and that tool may contain some records, or some of those communications may be of record quality. So if I send you a proposal, for example, to do some work, and you send me an email saying, yes, do the work, we have a binding contract. Your yes becomes a part of a collection of email, which includes my proposal and your response, and together that forms a contract, offer and acceptance. And therefore that would be a record. But in many cases, people have informal content related to the email. They don't use punctuation well. They don't use grammar well. They don't say exactly what they want. They don't reread it. And we have a lot of subjective information in our email. There are rarely any procedures or controls on our email except for mailbox size. I have encountered so many of our clients who are somewhere on the continuum of being concerned about the email problem to working toward a solution. While many are close to a solution, I haven't quite seen the perfect solution, but there are many that are pretty far along in the process. The key, though, is to determine that most emails are not records of the organization. Just as emails are a tool of communication, it's like picking up the telephone. We don't record those phone calls and make them records of the organization. Therefore, the emails, just because they were recorded, doesn't make them a record. Understand the distinction between a recording and a record. You get junk mail in the physical mail. It is recorded and printed. It is not a record. And there is a huge difference between recordings, or recorded material, and records. But in litigation, all recorded material is subject to discovery. That means that all the junk mail, all the information, all the drafts, all the emails are subject to litigation and subject to discovery and litigation, even though it's not a record of your organization. You recorded it. It's in the control of your organization. How can you say that that recorded material is not accurate? But we don't want to put restrictions on employees because it will reduce the efficiency of employees. First, the next thing to understand is the value of email. These are rough analysis. We didn't do a systematic study. It's just my intuitive understanding of how this works. What are records within email? Most people are 0 to 5%. I mean, you ask them, they'll tell you, oh yeah, all my emails are important. The reality is only a few are really records of the organization in a traditional sense that document, serve as evidence of transactions, for example. A big area is work in progress, maybe 10 to 30%. Those are, you're building a building, you're hiring a person, you're revising a procedure, you're working collaboratively, you're sending ideas back and forth. There's a collection of information. I would prefer work in progress be taken out of the email system and managed separately. And then we would have a project manager for that project. It would be great if all the emails related to a project were coded in a certain way so they automatically go into the collaborative work in progress section. And then when the project is done, and projects do end, the project manager makes sure that any of those emails or attachments that are records are preserved properly and there's a full set of documentation, and then presses a button and all the work in progress for that project is destroyed. I know that's a real radical idea. Even the concept of having a project manager isn't a radical idea, but it's the best idea I have on how to deal with the work in progress problem. The 65% or so to 100% of all our emails are junk. So if you start with the assumption that all email is junk, you're doing pretty well because you're right most of the time. Now we have to make sure if it's a record, it moves to the right place. So how do we do that? Define all email as non-record material. Employees must manage the email records, not the recordings. Identify what's a record, assign a record series plus retention period, and then store that preferably in an electronic filing system like an electronic document management system, or print and store it on paper files. I have reached the point that a shared server, where for a collaboration for a department is just not doing it. There's no retention, it's unmanaged, it's just a common place to put stuff and put junk in most cases. I'm looking for better management of all of that. And notice this is the same formula for managing all records. If it's a record, it needs to be classified, put in an electronic document management system. If it's paper in a central filing system, that's fine too. And I want then the rest of the email to self-destruct in 30 to 45 days. If it was 60 days, I'm okay. 90 days I can live with. Work toward 30 or 45 days. Why that period? Because if an employee doesn't act on the email in 30 to 45 days, they never will. They need to identify what's a record and get it into the electronic record-keeping system, and they need to do it quickly. Can you imagine employees who have never done any of this, and they have 3 or 4 or 5 years of email, and now they're told, identify the records in that system in your email and move it into a record-keeping system? They'll never do it. And by the way, that employee has probably moved on to another job, and all their old emails were destroyed, and the company would have lost many of their records during that period. Also, the backups must have the same cycle of 30 to 45 days. Extremely important on all these systems in the electronic record-keeping world, email being a very important one, but all the electronic records. If you're going to adopt a retention program, identify records, move the records to electronic repository, assign a record series linked to retention, then the backups must reflect that same retention period. Therefore, a very short cycle on backups is really desirable. Doing an annual backup just in case is a real bad idea. and a lot of the IT professionals are starting to understand this. Okay, now we're into our really last topic, and we just have a few more minutes for this session. I think I'll be able to get it all in. So we've had a lot of questions about establishing the global retention schedule. Maybe your headquarters in the United States and Canada, and you're doing business in Europe. You have offices there. How do you apply retention? How do you establish a global retention schedule? You have two options, basically. One is to do complete international legal research, and I probably should have said, and manage the global retention schedule. And the other is to develop a U.S. and Canada legal research and retention, and manage the retention schedule within the United States and Canada, and do an international review. So what do I mean by these two options? Option one is complete international legal research. What are the methods of doing that? Subscription services. Information Requirements Clearinghouse does have an international law module. We do sell it as part of Retention Manager. We do advise clients, though, it is not complete. We are using English translations. We don't have the resources, nor are there enough clients who will pay the freight to do a complete legal research database. But there are some companies that are working toward that goal, and you have to inquire whether their research is complete or not. And we also have some international law firms who are active gathering legal research for use by all the lawyers in their firms throughout the world, and have some expertise in records retention. Those will not give you the legal research. They'll give you a legal opinion, because the law firms don't want to give up control and possession of their legal research. This method is expensive. You could spend $5,000 a country or more to acquire this information. Then, of course, when you do updates, you'll be paying for that again. We have problems of the native language versus English translations. I can read English, and I can read Canadian English too, and I'm okay a little bit with UK English, but I don't read French, and I don't do German or Russian or Chinese or Japanese or any of those. When you translate it to English so you can work with it, those are interpretations. That is not the language of the law. It doesn't mean the English version says what the native language version says. So there's always risks there. There's an issue of custom and practice. We in the United States and Canada have pretty standard views of how we deal with things like statutes of limitation, and what if the law requires you to keep records, doesn't establish a retention period, and why we do retention and things like that. Pretty common understanding of how that's done. That's our custom and practice. In Europe, they think of the world very differently. They don't have the level of litigation we do. They're very, very strong in Europe in privacy, much more than North America, though we're starting to adopt some laws on privacy. And the difference is, in a normal retention schedule, there may be requirements to keep records at least 6 years. Under a privacy requirement in Europe, the law might say you cannot have the record longer than 5 years. So how do you come up with a retention schedule where you have it at least, the record's at least 6 years, but not longer than 5? That's a problem, and that's a problem about managing an international retention schedule. And then you have the management of the research from all the different countries, and the changing and updates, and, as I said, translations and meaning, and the differences in the retention period. So Switzerland could have a 10-year retention period for accounting tax records, which they do, and the United States and Canada could have a 6-year. Which one do you follow, or do you make exceptions for each country, and how do you manage all of that? By the way, Retention Manager does have a function called Legal Subgroup that can manage retention differences by jurisdiction. Option 2 is what I really prefer, and that's the U.S. and Canada schedule plus international review. How would we do this? you develop a U.S. or U.S. and Canada. The reason I do that is the United States and Canada, the research is in English. Our research is complete in both those areas. We fully understand what it's all about, and we have common understandings. Therefore, use that as the base. We can work with that. Retention Manager, as said, has complete research and English language. Send the schedule to your foreign officers who will forward to the local attorneys for review. Just about every foreign office will have a local attorney they work with. You send them the retention schedule, the base schedule, and let them review it to see if they should add on anything. The local country attorney may recommend a longer retention period for records, but never shorter. So if you say 6 years, then that country can adopt 10 years and keep the records in that country, but not shorter. With one exception, in these privacy issues, they may have to keep it shorter by law. And so as long as it's done in that country, that's fine. But under this scheme, Central Records Management does not manage all these exceptions. That's a huge burden, requires a huge number of staff, a lot of work, and as I said previously, managing the legal research requires a lot of work. It's very expensive. This method allows you to have a U.S. and Canada, focus your attention on that, and countries outside of North America can make an exception. You'll have a way of dealing with it. You don't have to keep track of it. You might keep a file on all of that, but you don't have to build it into your full retention schedule. That's just an exception they do in that country. So that's the way I would handle it. I know I've covered a lot of material for today's session. Please feel free to contact Andre for additional information about what we do and how we can help you. If you do have additional questions, feel free to send it to us. We'll try to answer everybody's question the best we can. And I truly appreciate all of you joining us today. I hope you got a lot out of the session. As Andre said, we will post the slides and the full presentation on our website, hopefully in a few days. Hope you all have a good day, and we look forward to meeting with you sometime in the future. We are planning future webinars on various topics that touch on records and information management. Thank you for your time and attention.